They called him the Silent Boss, a man who ruled New York without ever raising his voice. While others fought for the spotlight, he built an empire in the shadows. This is the story of how Carlo Gambino vanished into history by mastering the art of never being seen. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. There was no gunshot, no chase, just the soft beeping of a heart monitor in a second-floor room at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. A dying man, pale against a thin pillow, leaned in close to a detective he barely knew. His lips moved with effort. The room was silent except for one word, Gambino. No first name, no context, just that spoken like a confession or a curse. And then, nothing. The man was gone before the nurse returned with morphine. That name would ripple through Federal buildings like a silent tremor. It wasn't shouted like Capone or whispered like Gotti. It hovered, quiet, weightless, and terrifying in its restraint. For the FBI, it was the beginning of a chase that would last the rest of his life. And most of theirs, they knew the outlines. A man who never used a phone, never signed an order, never held a press conference, no mugshots, no grandstanding, just a quiet figure. Always nearby, always untouched. One agent recalled watching him from a rooftop stackout near Columbus Park. The man, old, gray-suited, fedora low, was feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons like any retiree. He'd do it at the same time every Thursday. But the week before, 2 Union delegates had disappeared. The week after, a loan shark's house in Queens mysteriously burned down. No orders had been given, no calls had been made. But people acted, because the man in the park existed. He was known simply as Carlo Gambino. To the public, he was nobody. But to insiders, he was the throne itself, not seated on it, but carved into its shape. No bullets fired, no fingerprints found, and yet whole neighborhoods moved to his rhythm. That moment in the hospital room wasn't the first time his name had been uttered in fear, but it was the first time law enforcement understood what it meant to chase a ghost, because Carlo Gambino wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hitman. He wasn't even a front boss in the traditional sense. He was something colder, something quieter, and far more dangerous. He didn't fight for power. He absorbed it slowly, carefully, like water rising through the walls of a house, unnoticed until everything was already rotted through. But before he was the silent boss of Brooklyn, before his name lived in the air like a superstition, he was just a boy from a coastal town in Sicily. To understand Gambino, we have to start there. In the early 1900s, the sun rose hot and golden over Castellamma del Golfo, a rugged fishing village cradled in cliffs and salt winds. Boys played barefoot among crumbling stone alleys. Men whispered names in shadows. And loyalty wasn't a virtue. It was a survival strategy. This was mafia country, not the Hollywood kind, but the original, a code born of centuries of occupation, injustice, and blood feuds. The Cosa Nostra was not romanticized. It was feared. It governed without government. Carlo Gambino was born here in 1902, into a family already entangled in that world. His father, Tommaso, was a humble landowner with deeper ties than he let on. He taught Carlo 3 things: never brag, never owe, and never be the loudest man in the room. As a child, Carlo was slight, serious, and watchful. While others postured, he observed. At age 10, he watched a neighbor vanish after refusing to pay tribute to a visiting don. By 12, Carlo was delivering coded messages between town elders. He didn't speak unless asked to, but when he did, he chose his words like a man placing coins into a counting tray. Slow, deliberate, precise. Stories from that time say he never cried as a baby. When asked why he was so quiet, he'd reply simply, "No one listens to children who talk too much." In the shadow of Mount Inisi, amid dry winds and rust-colored hills, he learned the first rule of his life. Control is not taken with force, it's taken with silence. But Sicily was changing. By the 1910s, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime had begun a brutal crackdown on mafia activity. Don after don was arrested, deported, or executed. Entire families were uprooted. The old way was collapsing under the boot of a new order. And so, at the age of 19, Gambino made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would leave. The ship was small, rusted, and overcrowded. The passage to America was rough, not just the sea, but the future. Most immigrants arrived at Ellis Island with dreams of freedom. Carlo arrived with a plan. In 1921, Brooklyn was a different kind of wilderness. Ethnic neighborhoods carved themselves into blocks. Italians on one street, Irish on another, Jews on the next. Everyone was poor. Everyone was armed. Everyone had something to prove. And then came Prohibition. It was the perfect storm, a national ban on alcohol, and a new immigrant class willing to break that ban for profit. The streets of New York became veins pulsing with illegal money. Booze flowed through speakeasies, unions became rackets, and justice was something you could negotiate with a handshake or a knife. Gambino started small. He worked for Salvatore D'Aquila, one of the earliest mafia bosses in New York. But he wasn't muscle, he wasn't flashy. He was quiet, efficient. He tracked shipments, kept books, and learned patterns while others got drunk on fast cash. He was memorizing the names of every crooked cop and every corrupt dock foreman. Within a 5-mile radius, he never gambled, never smoked, never carried more money than he needed. His only indulgence was a crucifix he wore beneath his shirt, and even that he never spoke about. In the back rooms of Brooklyn bakeries, where flour dust mixed with whispers, Carlo Gambino built the foundations of an empire, not by shouting orders, but by making himself indispensable. People liked him, or rather they respected him. He didn't threaten, he didn't cajole, but when he spoke, things happened. Trucks ran on time, judges looked the other way, and enemies found themselves surrounded before they knew they were in a fight. By the end of the decade, Gambino had something rarer than power. He had trust. Not love, not fear, trust. And in the underworld, trust is what keeps a man alive longer than a gun ever could. Decades later, when agents looked back through records, they were stunned at how few traces he left. He never owned property in his own name, never traveled without permission, never made enemies unless he had a backup plan already in place. He built his empire like a mason builds a cathedral, stone by stone, with no sign of the architect visible from the street. And yet he was everywhere. One man, a former associate, once said, "He didn't sit at the table. He was the one who decided where the table went." The myth of Carlo Gambino isn't just that he never got caught. It's that no one could prove he'd ever even raised his voice, and in the world, he ruled a world of blood, betrayal, and ambition. That was a kind of power no gun could match. Now that we've seen the legend, we rewind. We go back, not to a moment of violence, but to the birth of a strategy, to the first time a boy in Sicily learned how silence could bend the world. The story of Carlo Gambino doesn't begin in a courtroom, or a casino, or a crime. Scene? It begins with a whisper, and it ends the same way. In the hill-shadowed cradle of western Sicily, where stone paths twist through lemon groves and salt wind rises from the harbor, there sits a village that does not speak its name aloud, Castellamare. Del Golfo to outsiders it was a fishing port sun-swept, rough-edged, forgotten by maps, but to those born inside its walls, it was something older, heavier, a place where men disappeared. not because of war or hunger, but because of silence. A place where names were traded like currency and vengeance was measured in generations. It was here in August of 1902 that Carlo Gambino was born into a world already written in blood. His father, Tommaso Gambino, was a farmer on paper. In truth, he was something more complicated, an enforcer of oaths, a man with one foot in the vineyard and the other in the invisible chain that ran from Palermo to Naples, and from Naples back to Castellamare. Tommaso taught Carlo his first lessons early, not through punishment or reward, but through observation. They would walk the ridge line at dusk, watching the sun pour over dry hills, and he would say things that didn't need repeating. Men who want to be seen will be buried fast. You can tell if a man is lying by how quickly he drinks. Talk wastes power. Carlo listened. That was his gift. He didn't challenge, he didn't play-act. He watched the faces of men arguing over olives. He studied how debts were settled without money ever being mentioned. While other boys learned to steal figs or swing stones, Carlo learned how power moved without making noise. By age 7, he had already memorized the names of the 5 men who sat beneath the chestnut tree outside the cathedral. The ones who never spoke during Mass, but always nodded after. By age 10, he was sweeping the back storerooms of a tailor shop that never sold a single piece of clothing, only envelopes. At 12, he was carrying those envelopes. They weren't marked. They didn't need to be, and he never looked inside, not once. But even then, he understood what was at stake. These weren't letters, they were coordinates, allegiances, messages wrapped in silence, and Carlo never made a single delivery late. He moved like a shadow barefoot, straight-backed, the collar of his shirt always buttoned, a silver crucifix tucked beneath the fabric like a blade. That crucifix would become his trademark, worn beneath his clothes, kissed only in private. It was not a sign of faith, it was a reminder of lineage, of judgment, of rules that no law could touch. Those who knew the boy said he never shouted, never cried, never laughed longer than a breath, but when he entered a room, grown men grew quiet. The first time Carlo was asked to lie, it was to Don Luigi Marchesi, the most feared man in the province. A rival had vanished after a wedding gone between the toast and the dessert course. Some said it was jealousy. Others said it was unfinished debts. No one knew for certain. Marchesi summoned young Carlo, just 13, to his olive grove. You delivered a message that day? The Don asked. Carlo didn't nod, he didn't flinch. He simply stared at the man's face. Yes, Don Marchesi. Who gave it to you? I don't recall. You don't recall, or you won't recall. What I recall is only for you, Don Marchesi. There was silence, and then a soft laugh. From that moment, Carlo was marked, not with ceremony, not with praise, but with recognition. He had passed the test. From then on, his tasks became more precise. He was sent to Trapani with handwritten figures. He was told to sit in on meetings but never speak. And above all, he was warned about the future fascism was rising. Mussolini's men were combing through the countryside, hunting down anyone with loyalty to the old codes. By the time Carlo turned 17, he had already seen 6 men disappear. Some went to prison, some to the bottom of ravines, and one was hanged from the balcony of a schoolhouse. His shoes missing, a note pinned to his chest with a kitchen knife. The note said one word, Oathbreaker. Carlo never forgot the handwriting, but he also saw what was coming. The fascists weren't like the Carabinieri. They didn't ask questions. They burned vineyards, they slaughtered goats. They dragged entire families into town squares and beat them for having the wrong surname. The mafia, once woven into the very roots of Sicily, was being ripped out by force in 1921. Carlo stood beside his father beneath the archway, of the cathedral. It was nearly dusk, bells were ringing, and black smoke rose from a field in the distance. Fascists had torched another farmhouse. "It's time," his father said. Carlo didn't ask what he meant. The passage had already been arranged. The ship was rusted and damp. It bore no name, just numbers stenciled in white. The hold smelled of fish and engine grease and the sweat of frightened men. They were all running from something. The regime, a debt, a name carved into the wrong piece of bark. But Carlo wasn't afraid. He carried a single bag. Inside it were 3 shirts, 1 photograph, and the crucifix. He stood on the deck as the Sicilian coastline disappeared behind mist and salt spray. He didn't cry. He didn't wave. He simply stared. The ocean ahead was not freedom. It was distance. At 19 years old, Carlo Gambino was leaving behind the only home he had ever known. Not to escape, not to forget, but to adapt. Because if Sicily had taught him anything, it was that the code, the real code, was not bound to one place. It traveled inside you. It spoke without speaking, and in America it would find new soil. But before Carlo ever touched American concrete, he had already made the most important decision of his life. He would never speak louder than he needed to. He would never forget the ones who vanished. And he would never ever be the man everyone watched. That would be his gift. That would be his weapon. And the world had no idea what was coming. The ship groaned like an old animal pulling into port, streaked with rust and layered in the breath of the unspoken. Rain tapped lightly on its upper deck as a lean young man stepped down onto the pier at Brooklyn Navy Yard. 1921, he carried no suitcase, wore no expression. Only a crucifix glinted beneath his collarbone, catching a sliver of the cold morning light as he looked up, not at the city, but through it. Carlo Gambino, 19 years old, entered America as if entering a long hallway, quiet, controlled, already planning where the exits were. To most men arriving from Sicily, this was a second chance. To Carlo, it was just the next position on the board. Brooklyn was many things in the 1920s, but peaceful wasn't one of them. The borough breathed smoke and shouted in a dozen languages. Bensonhurst, Red Hook, Coney Island, each had its own code, its own knives. The Irish controlled waterfront muscle, the Jews ran banks and backrooms, and the Italians, split between Sicilian loyalties and Neapolitan grudges, scrambled over turf that smelled of sausage grease and pistol powder. Prohibition had transformed the city into an open wound. Alcohol was illegal, but thirst was infinite. Every bar without a license turned into a business. Every alley without a police patrol turned into a war zone. And somewhere between those alleys and bars, a young man with soft eyes and still hands began to take notes. Carlo didn't join a crew. He apprenticed under a name already whispered across stoops: Salvatore Toto D'Aquila. One of the first true mafia dons in America. D'Aquila wasn't flashy. He didn't shout. That's why Carlo gravitated to him. There was a dignity to the man, a cold, calculating silence that reminded Carlo of the groves in Castellamare. D'Aquila ran numbers out of fruit trucks. He controlled bakeries that never opened and funeral homes that buried more secrets than bodies. He needed someone who wouldn't talk, wouldn't brag, wouldn't bleed when leaned on. Carlo fit the mold. At first he swept floors and kept ledgers. Then he began carrying messages again. But unlike Sicily, Brooklyn didn't tolerate boys. You proved yourself fast, or you disappeared, and the city was littered with the bones of men who thought charm mattered more than timing. Carlo learned fast which crews paid late, which ones skimmed from the top, which cops were addicted to heroin, and which ones were addicted to favors. He noticed details no one else saw, that one capo never sat with his back to a wall, that another only made deals on Thursdays, that the man who brought cigars to meetings always came back with less information. He spoke rarely, but he was always present, always listening, and that presence began to disturb people in subtle ways, like a painting you could never quite look away from. By 1923, D'Aquila entrusted him with more union disputes, shipments, that needed soft eyes, even sit-ins at other crews' meetings, not to speak, but to record who spoke too much. There were rules in this world. You didn't get blood on your own shoes, you didn't talk to the press, and you never made yourself irreplaceable to just one man. Carlo followed them religiously, but in private. He was already drawing maps, invisible ones, networks made of habits, not lines, a chart of New York's underworld, not by geography, but by silence, while others competed for scraps of territory. Carlo was watching the flow, the way money moved through tenement walls, how corruption moved through courtrooms, how greed moved through men like fever. Then came 1925, and everything changed. D'Aquila, once untouchable, began making mistakes. He grew paranoid, thought rivals were stealing from him. He started talking more, trusting less. He broke rules, appointing violent, erratic lieutenants just to instill fear. Carlo watched him crumble from the inside, and across the river, Giuseppe, Joe the boss, Masiria was waiting. Masiria was not like D'Aquila. He was theatrical, crude, obsessed with being seen. He dressed like royalty, demanded tribute like Caesar, and murdered indiscriminately. His only rule was survival. His men called him the boss of bosses, though behind his back they called him a butcher, and in a world so fragile, a butcher was dangerous. By 1927, the tension had become a fault line. Masiria wanted everything. D'Aquila refused to yield. War, inevitable and clumsy, began in stairwells and meat lockers. The newspapers didn't know the names, but they printed the aftermath. 5 killed in Bushwick, 2 strangled in Carroll. Gardens, 1 set on fire behind a fish market in Brighton Beach. Carlo didn't fight, he watched. It was the Castellamarese War, named not for geography, but for bloodline. Masiria against the men from Castellamar del Golfo, Sicilians who carried the old code versus those who had bent it in America. Gambino stayed neutral. It wasn't cowardice, it was precision. He offered no allegiance. He carried no banners, he made no enemies. He simply disappeared into the fog of the city, continuing his quiet work. And when D'Aquila was gunned down in 1928, Carlo didn't flinch, he didn't attend the funeral, he didn't make speeches. He just took the ledgers and found someone else who needed silence. By 1930, he had already begun aligning, not with Masiria, but with a younger, sharper mind rising from the chaos. Charles, Lucky, Luciano. Luciano was everything Masiria wasn't. Modern, calculating, and strategic. He saw the war as waste. He wanted a commission, not a kingdom. He wanted business, not blood. Gambino didn't speak to him directly, but he made sure Luciano's men noticed him. He passed along messages, small ones. Just to show his usefulness, he offered no loyalty, only results. Then came 1931, and Masiria was dead, betrayed at Coney Island over lunch, shot while playing cards, his hands still clutching the deck. Luciano had orchestrated it with Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and others at his side. The 5 families were born from the ashes, and Carlo, he was already in place. He didn't grab turf, he didn't demand a seat. But when Vincent Mangano took over the new family that would someday bear Gambino's name, Carlo was installed quietly, respectfully, as a capodicina, a lieutenant. He had survived a war by saying nothing, doing little, and being everywhere. But while Luciano and Genovese drew headlines while Anastasia bathed in blood, Carlo was thinking long-term. He didn't want a kingdom made of gold. He wanted a shadow that never needed replacing. That was his genius, not in aggression, but in calculated invisibility. By the end of 1931, Carlo Gambino had no rap sheet, no open cases, no rivalries, just a crucifix, a ledger, and a list of names stored in memory. He lived in a small apartment off 18th Avenue, wore the same gray suits, and took his coffee with one sugar, never more. He never touched drugs, never trusted a man who cheated on his wife, never left a meeting without wiping his fingerprints. From the glass, he watched men rise, watched them get cocky, watched them die, and while the city kept burning, he kept learning, because for Gambino, Brooklyn wasn't home. It was a classroom, a brutal, blood-soaked, whisper-filled cathedral of crime. And he had just graduated. The wedding was not lavish. There were no press clippings, no velvet napkins or champagne fountains, just lace gloves, a dim parish hall in Bensonhurst, and a groom who said less than 40 words the entire night. June 1932, and Carlo Gambino, age 30, stood beside a woman he barely knew, Catherine Castellano, younger sister of a rising figure in New York's underworld. There were photographs, but none widely circulated. One shows Carlo with a faint smile, his hands folded neatly, a crucifix beneath his collar barely visible, beneath the lapel of a gray suit. This wasn't a love story, it was a contract, signed with vows but sealed in strategy. Catherine was quiet, devout, loyal to the church. She rarely spoke in public, never attended social events alone, and took pride in anonymity. For Carlo, she was the perfect wife, not as a partner, but as a gatekeeper. She was blood to Paul Castellano, a man with ambition, appetite, and lineage, and Gambino knew that power in this world wasn't just taken. It was inherited, absorbed, grafted onto the bone. By marrying Catherine, he wasn't just building a family. He was securing a future throne. The Castellanos weren't yet royalty, but they were close. Paul was climbing, slow, relentless, arrogant. He was already being groomed by Vincent Mangano, and though Carlo rarely voiced an opinion, he watched. He saw Paul's hunger, the suits that cost too much, the dinners with union bosses, the disdain for violence, but the readiness to benefit from it. Gambino had no such tells. He wore the same shoes for 5 years. He never drank in public, never chased women, and never laughed louder than necessary. Where Paul reached, Carlo listened. Where Paul bragged, Carlo remembered. In the months following the wedding, Gambino was gifted a corner of the Bakery Workers' Union, a small gesture, meaningless on the surface, but inside it was an artery to something bigger. Bakeries didn't just need dough. They moved sugar, flour, oil, and fuel. Every delivery had a route. Every route had a cost. Every cost had a collector. Carlo streamlined it, silently. The kickbacks doubled. The complaints dropped. The problems disappeared. He never made speeches. He never asked for more. But soon after, he was entrusted with the Pier 29 port loading zone, a critical piece of waterfront influence. Nestled between 2 Irish-controlled shipping terminals, other men had been killed trying to hold it. Gambino took it without firing a shot. He replaced the foreman with a man whose brother owed him money. He arranged for the stevedores to get paid on Fridays and doubled the envelope that went to the union rep's mistress. He never touched a crate, but every crate moved how he wanted. His methods were not about force, they were about consistency. A port worker once said, "You never saw him, but when you opened your paycheck, you'd feel him in the numbers." By 1934, Gambino had quietly positioned himself as a transportation whisperer, controlling bakery routes, port docks, and now, the truck drivers. That final piece was critical. Trucks moved everything: cigarettes, alcohol, bodies, bribes, ballots. Whoever owned the trucks owned the tempo of the streets. He never signed anything himself, never had a front-facing role, but everyone in the system began using the same phrase. Run it past Carlo. He didn't give orders, he gave looks, he didn't demand, he suggested, and in that quiet, people obeyed. It was around this time that the FBI first noticed his name, not in arrest records, but in pattern reports. Gambino was showing up in the margins, never as a suspect, but always as a variable. A warehouse changed ownership, and 2 weeks later, a bakery in Queens started doubling its flour orders. A port union strike was averted, and the next day, a Teamsters delegate bought a house in Bay Ridge. In each case, Gambino's name was whispered but never written. He was, as one agent described, a stabilizer. Like mortar between bricks, you don't see it, but it's holding the building up. Meanwhile, his personal life stayed exactly that. Personal. He and Catherine lived in a modest 2-story house off Ocean Parkway. With modest furniture and modest habits, they had 4 children. They went to Mass on Sundays. He answered the door himself. Neighbors said he was polite, but distant. No one recalled ever hearing music through the walls. No one saw him drunk. No one ever saw him lose his temper. But behind that placid routine was a man meticulously reshaping. His world, his motto, was whispered during a sit-down one evening in 1935. When a younger associate questioned his slow, conservative pace, Carlo leaned forward, placed his teacup down, and said, "Make money quietly. Let the noisy men die first." The words became doctrine, and in the years that followed, noisy men did die. Dutch Schultz, too erratic; Lepke Behalter, too cruel; Joe Venanci, too nervous. Each came into power like a thunderclap, each left with a bullet or a rope around the neck. But Gambino? He stayed. By 1936, the Castellano connection had cemented into something more than alliance. Paul was rising, but Carlo was expanding sideways, not just vertically. He embedded himself into the infrastructure: bakery supplies, truck routing, dock schedules, even waste collection. Not the glamorous rackets, the ones no one paid attention to, but they paid. Over time, they paid better than drugs or gambling. Gambino avoided attention like a priest avoids sin. He refused flash, wore neutral suits tipped evenly, never arrived early, never left late. He didn't call meetings, he attended them, and when he spoke, people leaned in to hear, not because he was loud, but because he was never repeated. A single nod from Carlo meant more than a monologue from another boss. But his real genius lay in knowing when not to move. When the Castellamarese War veterans began growing restless again, when Albert Anastasia began pushing for more blood, when Vito Genovese began acting like a king without a crown, Gambino stepped back. He told his crew to be patient, to avoid fights, to double the envelopes, to lay low, and while the wolves snapped at each other, he fattened his share. By 1939, without ever holding the title of boss, Gambino controlled more routes, union contacts, and operational links than anyone in the Mangano family. Paul Castellano had more ambition, but Carlo had more leverage, and yet he remained secondary on purpose because Carlo understood what others didn't. Power wasn't about being first in line, it was about controlling the line itself. He once told a young associate, "You don't need to drive the car, just own the road." Those who underestimated him never saw the difference in a world obsessed with visibility. Carlo Gambino mastered disappearance, and as New York began its slow crawl into the 1940s, the silent boss was already in position, not as a figurehead, but as the bones of the empire. All because, instead of climbing, he married in. The steam rose off the East River like breath from a sleeping animal, slow, heavy, full of warning. It was 1942. and the docks along Brooklyn's waterfront were groaning under the weight of war shipments, crates of rubber, metal, meat, and bullets stacked like pulpits to a new kind of god. Industry. From Red Hook to Greenpoint, ships arrived around the clock, loaded with the raw material of global power. America was at war, and the mafia was at work. In the middle of it all, Carlo Gambino was invisible, but everywhere he owned no trucks. He signed no manifests. He didn't even keep an office. But every longshoreman who wanted to keep his hands intact, every teamster who didn't want his tires slashed, every butcher who wanted to keep his cold room working knew exactly where to send the envelope, because by the 1940s, Gambino's reach had extended like ivy across the infrastructure of the city. The meatpacking union was his first prize, quietly acquired, ruthlessly maintained. Pork, veal, beef, these weren't just groceries, they were currency. Controlled supply meant controlled prices, and controlled prices meant favors. He appointed the union's accountant himself, a thin man named Ritchie, who dressed like a school teacher, and carried the keys to 3 safety deposit boxes. Gambino never entered but always balanced. From there, the empire spread across the loading docks, the textile warehouses, the frozen fish lockers. Each place had a man with no title but full authority, and each man answered to someone they never named, but influence, even when silent, attracts attention. There were whispers now, in precincts, in City Hall, in the back rooms of federal buildings where maps of New York were pinned with red thread and thumbtacks. The name Gambino surfaced again and again, not as a suspect, but as his shape, an outline, a presence. He's the ghost in the room. One informant told an FBI agent, never talks, never signs, never seen, but somehow everyone listens to him. What made Gambino terrifying wasn't violence, it was vacuum. Wherever he operated, opposition disappeared, not in gunfire, but in silence. Sometimes it looked like suicide. Sometimes a union vote shifted just enough. Sometimes a car bomb that had no fingerprints and no motive, but never a trace that led back to him. He had formed, by now, an unspoken alliance with a man who did prefer bullets, Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was the dark blade of the underworld, co-founder of Murder, Inc., the mafia's enforcement arm that handled hits with an industrial rhythm, while Gambino cleaned his suits with vinegar and tucked his collar with precision. Anastasia barked orders through clouds of cigar smoke and threatened waiters who spilled his coffee. On the surface, they had nothing in common. One ruled with noise, the other with stillness. But they understood each other. Gambino respected Anastasia's efficiency. Anastasia respected Gambino's reach. They never put it on paper. They never toasted it over whiskey. But somewhere between the fish market and the dry cleaner, a pact was made. Carlo wouldn't ask for hits. He didn't need to. But if a problem arose, if a rival threatened a union stronghold, if a foreman got too greedy, if a young capo refused to shut up, Carlo would simply withdraw, and Anastasia's men would fill the space. In return, Gambino funneled laundered money through a web of front businesses, dry cleaners, tailor shops, trucking companies with 5 trucks and 35 invoices. One storefront in Bensonhurst filed taxes for a shoe repair business. It hadn't fixed a single pair of shoes in 6 years. The IRS began to notice, but couldn't pen it. They sent agents to watch, sat in idling cars with fogged-up windows, clipped photos through blinds. Still, nothing. Gambino never met publicly with Anastasia. He never made handoffs, never appeared at weddings or funerals that required explanation. But when Louis Brillo, a dock manager who'd tried to extort an extra 10% from shipping crews, was found hanging by piano wire in a garage in Flatbush, federal agents knew exactly who had benefited and exactly who would never be charged. Carlo didn't laugh. he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded once when the news reached him and returned to counting receipts from a bakery in Queens that only sold 6 loaves a day and moved $3,000 a week. To him, that was the game. Others played for control. Carlo played for durability. He didn't trust people. He trusted process. He didn't build friendships. He built dependencies. And Anastasia, for all his volatility, understood that. He once told a lieutenant, "You want a name in the paper? Go shoot someone. You want a name that survives? Go sit with Carlo there." Relationship was tested in 1946 when the heat around Murder, Inc. exploded. Multiple informants began naming names. Prosecutors built charts with mugshots connected by red yarn. Anastasia, furious and cornered, ordered the killing of a witness. A mistake. The press ran wild. The Mad Hatter, they called him. The FBI doubled its surveillance. Gambino said nothing. He didn't flinch, but internally, he was repositioning because Carlo knew something even Anastasia didn't. Violence was loud. It created paperwork. Bullet holes made people look. And in a world that was getting smarter, with better surveillance, better audits, better agents, noise was now weakness. He began shifting more assets into shell companies, disguised his influence through third-party contractors, often run by men who didn't know who they were working for. One example, a moving company in Hoboken that hired ex-convicts and reported enormous fuel losses. Another, a butcher co-op that over-ordered salt by the ton and never had any meat in its freezers. The numbers never made sense, but the profits did. Meanwhile, other families started watching Gambino more closely. They didn't understand how he was rising. He wasn't making power plays. He wasn't killing off rivals. And yet he kept expanding. One day it was the docks, next it was the garment district. Then meat, then trucking. He wasn't climbing the hierarchy, he was becoming the soil it stood on. What unsettled other dawns was that Carlo never seemed to want more. He accepted lower titles, refused unnecessary promotions, didn't sit at the head of tables, but every decision somehow passed through him. In 1948, an agent noted in a confidential memo, "He's always around the explosion." Never knew the spark, but sparks were catching up to Anastasia, and Carlo, watching silently, knew the winds were shifting. He began reducing contact, slowly, strategically. Where once he and Anastasia's men met at night in back kitchens, now they met through intermediaries. Where once they exchanged envelopes, now there were phone messages left with receptionists who didn't ask questions, not because Gambino was afraid, because he was preparing. He had seen enough blood to know where the river ended, and Albert Anastasia, for all his strength, was heading toward it. Gambino began grooming new lieutenants, men who shared his discipline, who spoke in half sentences, who never carried phones. He consolidated control of smaller, quieter rackets, funeral supply chains, ice delivery routes, lamp cord manufacturers whose shipping containers doubled as money safes. He kept his margins low, kept his promises, never raised his voice, and never forgot that the men who died fastest were the ones who needed to be noticed. By 1949, Anastasia was being watched full-time, but Gambino, he remained the shadow in the room, unnamed in the papers, unknown to the general public, and yet his name moved through courthouses like static electricity, felt, never traced. His legacy would not be violence. It would be precision, and his greatest weapon wasn't a gun, it was patience. Allies in low places had served him well, but alliances like men aged, cracked, collapsed. Carlo Gambino was ready for what came next, not with blood, but with stillness. The barber was finishing the hot towel when the door opened. October 25, 1957, Manhattan's Park Sheraton Hotel. 7th Avenue, just past 10:30 in the morning. The barber shop was empty, but for one man draped in a white smock, eyes closed, steam rising gently from his face. The radio murmured in the corner. Outside, cabs honked like distant geese in traffic. The door opened quietly, no bell, no announcement. Just two men in coats, faces unreadable. What happened next lasted less than 11 seconds. 6 shots, point blank, glass shattering, blood streaking the mirrors. The body of Albert Anastasia, underworld enforcer, co-founder of Murder Inc., and boss of the Mangano family, fell sideways off the chair, tangled in the smock, half-shaved, his mouth frozen in an expression that no one could agree on. Shock, maybe, or understanding. The city panicked. The headlines screamed betrayal. Mob boss slain in Midtown ambush. Execution in a barber shop. The Mad Hatter is dead. But one man said nothing. He didn't issue a statement, didn't show up at the funeral, didn't appear in any photos of the crime scene. Carlo Gambino stayed home. His hands remained folded. His suit remained pressed. His voice, quiet, controlled, gave nothing away, but behind the scenes, every wiretap, every informant, every FBI file whispered the same truth. This was his move. It hadn't come suddenly. This was no impulsive coup. It had been built inch by inch, year by year, like laying down piano. Wire in the dark, threading it between the ankles of giants, Albert Anastasia had once been a useful monster. Brutal, unpredictable, fearless, but by 1957 he had become a liability. His violence had lost its edge, his paranoia had sharpened into recklessness, and his politics were sloppy. He had started showing up in public without clearance, sat with people he wasn't supposed to, took deals that stank of desperation. He'd once been the sword, but now he was the noise, the heat, the crack in the structure, and Carlo Gambino did not tolerate cracks. He had spent 2 decades weaving himself into the foundation, not for flash, not for vanity, but for control, quiet, uninterrupted control. So he did what he always did. He aligned himself with someone louder. In this case, Vito Genovese. Genovese was no fool. He had ambitions of his own, to become capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, but he needed Anastasia out of the way. Gambino, always observant, always one step ahead, saw the opportunity. There. Agreement was never written, never spoken above a whisper, but the pact was clear. Gambino would provide the access. Genovese would provide the force. And together they would reset the table. The hit on Anastasia was clinical. No personal vendetta, no message left behind, just erasure, the kind Gambino valued most. By nightfall, Anastasia's reign was over. His crew scattered, his power base cracked open like a crab shell underfoot. And Gambino? He didn't step forward, he simply moved into the vacuum. He met with the lieutenants, reassured them, calmed them, promised stability, promised profits. And in that soft lull between fear and certainty, they accepted him. They didn't see a takeover, they saw a solution. But the streets weren't the only ones watching. Just weeks later, November 14th, 1957, over 100 high-ranking members of the American Mafia gathered at a secluded property in Appalachian, New York. A summit, a coronation, a rebalancing of power after Anastasia's death. Gambino was there, of course he was, but he left no signature in the guest book. The meeting, held at the estate of Joseph Barbara, was meant to be discreet, but state troopers noticed the suspicious parade of out-of-state Cadillacs, the surge of visitors to a quiet neighborhood. Within minutes, the place was surrounded. Raids, scrambling men in suits, muddy shoes through hedges, hats thrown into the brush. 62 men were detained. Lucchese, Genovese, Bonanno, some tried fake names. Some claimed to be salesmen. It didn't matter. The FBI finally had a list, a roster of America's criminal elite. But one name was missing. Carlo Gambino had slipped out early, just minutes before the police arrived. Some say he sensed it. Some say he had been warned. Others believe he never intended to stay long in the first place. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He simply excused himself, stepped into a car, and was back in Brooklyn by dinner. From that day on, he became a different figure, no longer a shadow, but a center of gravity. The family he inherited, once the Mangano family, then Anastasia's, now began to quietly reshape around him. Operations were streamlined, books were cleaned, violence was reduced. Territories once controlled by loud men were passed to patient ones. The newspapers focused on Genovese, on the summit, on the arrests. But those inside the life understood. Gambino had just become a boss. Not declared, not anointed, but assumed. He didn't host celebrations. He didn't change his clothes. He didn't move into a bigger house. He simply got up earlier, walked a little slower, sat a little closer to the center of the table. In a world of impulsive men, Carlo Gambino had mastered the long game. He didn't murder to dominate. He didn't shout to command. He created absence and then filled it. Albert Anastasia had ruled with bullets. Carlo Gambino ruled with open chairs. It wasn't the house that drew attention. A modest two-story. On Howard Beach, brick and white siding, with a cracked driveway and a patch of lawn that Carlo Gambino insisted on watering himself. It wasn't the car either, a used black Plymouth, a decade old, with a worn steering wheel and an ashtray that never filled. Nor was it the clothes. Gray suits, pressed but not tailored, shoes polished but scuffed. To most neighbors he was just another Sicilian grandfather, quiet, polite, always seen leaving for Mass with a folded hat and a newspaper tucked under one arm. But behind that modest home sat an empire without borders. By the early 1960s, Carlo Gambino was no longer just a boss. He was the fulcrum. His power didn't rise. From spectacle, it spread, through structure, through influence, through a network so vast and so deeply layered that even federal prosecutors couldn't agree where it ended. He didn't control just men. He controlled systems. The trucking industry was his bloodstream, moving everything from textiles to bodies across state lines. Construction, particularly in Manhattan, paid him before it paid city inspectors. The garment district bent to his will without him ever setting foot inside it. Airport cargo, port unions, waste management, food distribution, even the supply of payphones and bus stations. Every one of them had a man who reported up, and at the top of every ladder, whether directly or through 10 quiet names, sat Carlo. He operated without ceremony. He rarely left Brooklyn. He never flew, never stayed in hotels. He preferred messages hand-delivered, not spoken over phones. His income was staggering. Estimates placed it at $2 to $4 million per month. Untaxed, untraceable, but he still clipped coupons for toothpaste. He had no mansion, no boat, no security detail. He attended baptisms with envelopes and funerals with silence. Where Gotti would later flash rings, Gambino folded napkins. Where other bosses barked orders, Gambino simply tilted his head. An entire block shifted. But Gambino's real genius wasn't in hoarding power. It was in sharing just enough of it. He formed what would become known as the Three-Family Alliance, an informal but ironclad coalition between his own family, Tommy Lucchese's crew, and the rising Colombo organization, helmeted by the young and politically savvy Joseph Colombo. Together, they coordinated labor rackets, bid rigging, union pension siphons, and multi-family sit-downs that kept bloodshed at record lows. Lucchese handled garment rackets and construction. Colombo opened doors through city officials and Italian-American civil groups. Gambino, ever the spine, kept the whole thing. Balanced, rarely attending the meetings in person, but always having the final word. They didn't just control New York. They set the rhythm for the East Coast, from Philly to Providence, Newark to Baltimore. Through these partnerships, Gambino was able to do what few bosses had ever managed: create a sustainable machine, one that printed money not from chaos, but from order, a machine where bullets were used sparingly and favors lasted longer than fear. His philosophy remained unchanged. Keep the noise down. Let the greedy men die first. He was ruthless, yes, but only when it made sense. There were no wild purges, no theater, only subtle erasures, quiet disappearances, promotions that came without warning and emotions without explanation. He avoided the spotlight the way other men avoided prison. He told his nephews, "The man who wants to be seen already has one foot in the grave." It worked. While the FBI threw everything at the likes of Genovese Bonanno and Carlo Gambino, slipped through the cracks, not because he ran, but because he left no shadow behind. And so when agents asked questions in Brooklyn, they got shrugs. "Mr. Gambino? You mean the old man on Ocean Parkway? He buys his fruit from Sal's like the rest of us. He'd go to Mass every Sunday, sit in the third pew, never take communion without whispering 3 prayers under his breath, and then, without fuss, he'd return home, passing 6 cars, 3 of which were federal, and wave politely. Inside the brown envelope tucked under his arm, sometimes it was a crossword, sometimes it was a union payroll list. No one ever knew, because Carlo Gambino's true empire wasn't built from territory. It was built from predictability. Every dollar accounted for, every whisper logged, every hand shaken only after the cost was measured. He had become something more than a mobster. He had become a system, and the world, whether it knew it or not, had already been living by his rhythm. Every morning, at exactly 7:45 a.m., the front door creaked open. A man emerged in a gray fedora, tilted just low enough to shade the eyes, never enough to seem suspicious. He walked with a cane, though he didn't need one. The shoes were always black leather, soft-soled, polished, but not too polished. The suit, dark brown, worn at the cuffs, a folded handkerchief in the coat pocket. The route never changed, down Ocean Parkway, past the bakery on Avenue O. He nodded to the grocer, tipped the boy stacking crates, stopped for a coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, and a folded copy of Il Progresso Italo Americano under one arm. 2. Anyone watching, he could have been a retired shopkeeper, a widower, maybe a former accountant. But inside every corner store he passed, every stoop he nodded toward, every sidewalk he crossed, the same thought echoed, "That's Gambino." And in Brooklyn, that meant something. It didn't mean bullets or blood or headlines. It meant order. It meant you knew when the trucks would come. It meant you didn't have to worry if the union rep stopped calling. It meant the city, despite its noise, had a pulse that beat evenly, because somewhere beneath the hum, this man in a gray fedora was still breathing. By the early 1970s, Carlo Gambino was in his 70s. He rarely traveled, never used a phone, didn't drive, didn't gamble, didn't drink, but across 5 boroughs and far beyond, his word remained absolute. And yet, no one could prove he gave any orders at all. The FBI, by now, had dedicated full task forces to watching him. They had agents tailing his sons, wiretaps in the bakery, cameras in the alley. They trailed him from Bensonhurst to Sheepshead Bay, recording conversations where nothing was ever said. One agent, years later, would write in his report, "He doesn't talk business in English. He doesn't talk business at all." Carlo had trained his inner circle well. Meetings were brief, Conversations meandered through religion, illness, weather, saints. Soup recipes, nothing direct, nothing actionable. But a week later, a warehouse would change ownership. A judge would delay a ruling. A rival would take a sudden trip to Florida and never come back. When asked about these events, Gambino would shrug. "I'm just a retired importer," the words delivered with a smile so soft it felt like a curtain slowly closing. In truth, he had imported once, back in the 1930s. Olive oil, small shipments, legitimate licenses. But the cover had stayed, like a shell fossilized around something far more dangerous. Behind the quiet walks and tidy garden hedges was a living web, a network of men tied to him not by force, but by devotion. They weren't soldiers, they were disciples. Each one owed him something, their rise, their safety, the life they still had, and for that, they would never speak his name in the wrong room. They would never take a step he hadn't already approved in silence. What baffled investigators was the scale. How could a man with no office, no files, no travel records, control millions of dollars a month, hundreds of operatives, entire sectors of New York's economy? They surveilled his home, they bugged his kitchen, they tapped his church confessional, they even trailed his grandson's school bus, and still nothing. When questioned under oath, one associate simply said, "I don't take orders, I just understand what Mr. Gambino wants." It was discipline, not fear, that protected him. He never tolerated showboating. He despised loud men. He once demoted a capo for buying a Cadillac in cash, not because it was illegal, but because it was obvious. Carlo lived by 3 rules. Never be the richest man in the room. Never say a name you wouldn't say at your mother's dinner table. Never tell anyone what you're thinking until you've already done it. His modesty wasn't a disguise. It was a weapon. He wore his years like armor. He played into the role. Hunched shoulders, soft voice, squinting through thick glasses, as if the world had grown too fast, too loud for him, but his mind never slowed. He remembered birthdays, tracked movements, took mental inventory of which judges owed him favors, which lieutenants were falling behind on collections, which alliances in Jersey needed soft pressure. When the Vietnam War began shifting federal attention toward draft resistance and narcotics, Carlo leaned into old-world businesses. Construction, shipping, garment unions, real estate. He avoided drugs entirely, not out of morality, but control. Narcotics brought heat. Heat brought snitches. Snitches brought trials. And Gambino didn't do trials. He once told a young associate, "You can't bribe a courtroom that's on television." The gray fedora became more than a trademark. It became a myth. When word spread that Carlo was seen walking through Bay Ridge, rival crews shifted meetings. When he attended a baptism, the envelope donations doubled. When he nodded at a grocer, that grocer's nephew was hired 2 days later, with full benefits. He didn't need power plays. He needed predictability. The FBI tried everything. Fake front companies, undercover operatives, bank audits, even following the priest who gave him communion. And yet every time they got close, the trail fell apart. No taped confession, no incriminating wire, no photograph of him saying anything but, "Tell your mother I said hello." Carlo Gambino was an institution made of whispers. And while agents banged desks in Washington, while other bosses argued over who got what cut, Carlo walked his Brooklyn block each morning like a parishioner walking to prayer. Hat in place, steps even, hand raised in a brief wave. To the government he was a ghost. To the streets he was gravity. And no one, not even those who hated him, ever tried to stop the man in the gray fedora, because they didn't know where his power began, and they never wanted to find out where it might end. The city was changing, not with explosions, but With erosion by the early 1970s, New York was beginning to shed its old skin. The cobblestone authority of the five families giving way to noise, neon and chaos. The air, once thick with whispers and fear, now trembled with something different, something louder. In the dark-paneled kitchens of Brooklyn, in the butcher shops where numbers once passed and cash stuffed envelopes, the men who had ruled for decades now sat quieter, older, watching, and Carlo Gambino, from the corner of his table, was watching more carefully than anyone. He didn't speak often, didn't rise to interrupt, but inside his silence he tallied the decline. Joe Bonanno was in exile, Vito Genovese, dead since '69, Tommy Lucchese, once his closest ally, buried long before, and then came the shot that shattered whatever illusion of balance remained. June 28, 1971, Joseph Colombo gunned down at a public rally in Columbus Circle. A bullet to the head, in front of cameras, children, priests. Colombo survived, but barely. He'd never speak again, never sit at another table. The message, regardless of who fired the gun, was received. Even visibility couldn't protect you anymore. Gambino didn't attend the hospital, didn't send flowers, didn't say a word, because, for Carlo, the end was always written long before the bullet. Colombo had broken a rule Gambino held sacred. Don't invite the public into the room. Colombo had founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, made speeches, quoted headlines. He brought attention, and attention, in this world, was a ticking clock, but it wasn't just the bosses collapsing. It was the rules themselves. The government had learned to listen. Not with notepads and rumors, but with wires. The RIFO Act, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors a new weapon, not to arrest the man with the gun, but the man who had built the room the gun was fired in. Wiretaps, hidden mics, IRS surveillance. Turncoat witnesses. The walls were listening now, and the five families, once invisible in their structure, now had cracks that pulsed like open wounds. Gambino watched as younger capos embraced flash. New suits, new cars, new addictions. They didn't understand the chessboard anymore. They were playing dice, and so he began planning for after. He had no illusions of permanence. He'd never wanted to be king forever, but he wanted the kingdom to survive him, and for that he needed a successor, someone who would carry his version of power, quiet, patient, precise. The choice surprised everyone. Not Aniello Delacroce, the street-hardened capo who had kept the crew in line for 2 decades. Not Nino Gaggi, not Carmine Lombardozzi, not one of the enforcers who had bled for the empire. Instead, Carlo Gambino named Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, a man from his own bloodline. Castellano had never been in the trenches. He was soft-spoken, book-smart, more interested in white-collar rackets than in muscle. He preferred spreadsheets over sit-downs, contracts over corpses. To the old guard, this was betrayal. To the street soldiers, it was madness. But to Carlo, it was design. Paul would protect the things that mattered most. The unions, the construction money, the insulation. From heat. He didn't need to be loved, he needed to be obeyed. Gambino's decision wasn't about charisma. It was about continuity. He once told a close associate, "Men who seek the crown usually break it in half. I want the crown to survive." So he gave it not to a fighter, but to a custodian. It was a calculated risk. But Carlo didn't take risks he hadn't already measured. He reorganized the structure before anyone could protest. He gave Aniello Delacroce the title of Underboss, an appeasement to the street crews, a gesture, a balancing act Delacroce accepted publicly. At least he knew better than to question Gambino, but inside the seeds of resentment had been sown. Not for Carlo, for what came next. The FBI, for their part, couldn't make sense of it. Why would Gambino choose a businessman over a warrior? Why pass the crown to a man who had never picked up a weapon? But that was the problem. They still believed this was a war. Carlo knew better. It wasn't war anymore. It was weather, and weather was survived with structure, not spectacle. So as the five families stumbled into the final chapters of the 20th century, limping from indictments, betrayals, and press coverage, one man stood calm in the eye of the storm. Carlo Gambino, still walking Ocean Parkway, still attending Mass, still brushing his hat before stepping into the sun. And though the world around him was cracking, he was already moving the next piece on the board. The living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The curtains were drawn halfway, allowing a blade of late afternoon light to cut across the carpet. In the corner, half lit by the glow of a reading lamp, sat an armchair, cream-colored fabric worn along the armrests, and in that chair, in a sweater too large for his shoulders, with one hand resting lightly on the rotary phone, sat Carlo Gambino. This was not the image the newspapers had hoped for. There was no throne, no gold watch, no marble floors, just a man in his mid-70s, shrinking slowly, carefully, but still holding the center of everything. By 1975, Carlo Gambino was frail, but never fragile. He suffered quietly from heart problems, a tightening in the chest, a stiffness in the limbs. He'd had spells. Doctors whispered concerns to his family, but Carlo never complained. He didn't ask for medication, didn't change his routine. He simply began doing less and made sure it never looked like retreat. He stopped attending weddings, even those of high-ranking soldiers. He skipped funerals, even for men he had once raised like sons. He no longer appeared at dinner meetings, and when Sunday Mass became too taxing, he started having the priest visit the house. But despite his absence from the streets, the machine never slowed. The Gambino family, the empire he had crafted with silence, patience, and structure, ran with such efficiency that some agents assumed he'd handed off power. He hadn't. What few knew was that his living room had become the control center. Not a war room. There were no maps, no radios, just a wooden-end table stacked with handwritten notes, a crucifix hanging above the phone, and beside it, a rotating group of trusted men, each stopping by, one at a time, to sit in the adjacent chair and speak in low tones. No one stayed longer than 15 minutes. No one raised their voice. No one left without direction. But here's the truth. Carlo never gave direct orders. He didn't say, "Do this." He said, "That seems like something worth handling." Or, "I imagine that won't fix itself." To most men, these were just observations. To his family, they were law. An informant would later tell the FBI. He'd say something like, "That store on 86th looks quiet lately." And the next day, the owner was paying twice the protection. Another. He never said no. He just looked at you until you knew what the answer had to be. And still, every week, same day, same time, came the envelopes. Union bosses, dock supervisors, bakery owners, construction firms, even barbers. Each brought him a quiet stack, always sealed, always uncounted in his presence. Carlo never touched the money in front of anyone. He would nod once, then pass the envelope to a side drawer, where it sat beside a rosary and an old silver letter opener. The room was small, but to the men who entered it, it felt larger than courtrooms, because what came from that chair wasn't advice, it was continuity. And in an era when the mafia was collapsing under its own weight, when the press printed the word mob like it was shorthand for rot, Carlo Gambino's house on Ocean Parkway felt like the last real cathedral of the code. He didn't entertain journalists. He didn't posture for photo ops. He didn't fight the government in court, because the government never got close enough to offer a courtroom. To them, Gambino had vanished. To his family, He had simply distilled, become something purer, tighter, more refined. Even his language had shrunk. Where other bosses rambled, cursed, shouted, Carlo rarely said more than needed. When a soldier came to him in '76 about an upstart crew muscling in on a sanitation route in Queens, Carlo didn't rage. He said, "If something threatens the balance, it should be removed carefully, without noise." 2 weeks later, the problem was gone. No headlines, no trial, just a route restored and a chair that remained empty. There were men who feared him, but there were more who revered him, not for his cruelty, but for his consistency. He didn't humiliate. He didn't belittle. He ruled the way weather ruled a field, inevitably. But illness does something to even the strongest systems. It frays the edges, slows the rhythm, and Gambino, for all his grace, felt the pull. There were days when he didn't rise until noon, when the visits had to be shorter, when his hands trembled just enough that he stopped pouring his own tea. And yet his memory never faded. He remembered names, dates, deals made 20 years ago. Which cousin married into which family, which judge owed him 2 favors, and which owed him 3, even in the decline of his body. His mind remained surgical, and so as 1976 began to wend toward fall, a new kind of quiet settled over the house. Not fear, not sadness, but preparation, because Gambino, always thinking 3 moves ahead, knew his time was closing. And what he feared most wasn't death. It was mess. He once said to Paul Castellano, sitting beside him under the crucifix, "Power is like a book. If you drop it, someone else writes the ending, so you pass it, while your hands are still steady." It wasn't just advice, it was his last act of control. And in that final season of quiet rule, as the city roared louder, as the next generation stumbled toward greed, Carlo Gambino did what he had always done best. He sat still. He watched carefully, and with a voice just above a whisper, he reminded the world, the most powerful man in the room is never the one who needs to speak. It was a Friday, October 15th, 1976. The skies over Brooklyn were overcast. Light rain tapped gently at the window panes of a quiet house on Ocean Parkway. Inside, the smell of warm bread hung in the hallway, mingling with the scent of old furniture, lemon polish, and the faint perfume of incense. Carlo Gambino sat in his usual chair, a cardigan draped over his shoulders, a wool blanket folded across his knees. The rotary phone, as always, sat just within reach. He wasn't speaking, not that morning. He hadn't said much in the days leading up. Just nods, glances, soft sighs. There was no panic, no ceremony. The end had not arrived as an intruder. It had come as a guest. He died not in custody, not in exile, not riddled with bullets outside a restaurant, but in his home, surrounded by his family, his wife of 44 years seated beside him, a crucifix hanging above the hallway. He was 74. To law enforcement, it was a quiet failure. No wiretap had caught him. No prosecutor had cracked him. No cell door had ever closed behind him. No cuffs had ever touched his wrists. To them, this was the man who got away. The ultimate operator, as one agent bitterly called him, a man who rewrote the blueprint for American organized crime and never once raised his voice doing it. The newspapers ran it in the morning editions. Carlo Gambino dies at 74. Mob leader passes in Brooklyn home. Some editors refused to call him a mob boss. Others couldn't print his name without a photo. But there were precious few photographs. The most circulated was one taken a year before. Gambino in a cardigan and slacks, standing at a crosswalk. A young child clutched his hand. He's smiling faintly, looking down at the child, not the camera. This was the image that lasted. Not the gunman, not the tyrant, not the feared Don, but the old man in a sweater, holding a child's hand as the light turned green. His funeral was held at the Our Lady of Grace Church in Brooklyn. Despite the rain, more than 2,000 people attended, men in dark coats, women with veils, children held close and silent. No press were allowed inside. No interviews were given. The hearse moved slowly, escorted not by sirens but by reverence. There was no violence, no arrests, no last-minute FBI raid, just rain and quiet and the closing of a chapter. But in that stillness the myth only grew, because in the century of American gangsters, Capone, Genovese, Luciano, Gotti, only one reached the end without handcuffs. No jail cell, no courtroom breakdown, no exile, no betrayal. Just a chair, a phone, a crucifix, and a quiet goodbye. His successors took over quickly. Paul Castellano stepped into the seat. Just as Gambino had planned, some approved, some murmured, but none dared challenge it. Not while the dirt at Gambino's grave was still fresh. In the months that followed, the FBI debriefed their agents, wrote internal memos, compiled failures. They examined the transcripts of 1,000 wiretaps, listened again to hours of silent rooms, read field notes that circled the same conclusion. He never said anything, and in that, he had achieved something no other boss had. He had outlasted the rules, because Carlo Gambino never needed threat of violence, never sought the spotlight, never let emotion dictate action. He ruled not with volume, but with structure, not with fear, but with certainty. He understood something others didn't, that true power is not what you take, but what you never lose. In the end, he left no memoirs, no confessions, no final words for the record, just the myth. The man who walked his block each morning in a gray fedora, who tipped the grocer, whispered greetings, who nodded at problems and watched them fix themselves, who built an empire without ever being seen building it, and then one day stopped breathing, not like a king falling, but like a clock winding down after doing exactly what it was built to do. There were chandeliers in the hallway, real crystal, imported from Venice. A marble staircase swept upward like the entrance to an opera house. Outside, manicured hedges curled around the driveway like a signature, and parked at the edge under the soft glow of floodlights. A Cadillac Fleetwood gleamed with the confidence of a man who never planned to hide. This was Paul Castellano's Staten Island mansion, and to anyone who had once knelt in a Bensonhurst butcher shop for orders, it was a warning in architecture. After Carlo Gambino's death in 1976, Castellano took the throne, not through charisma, not through fear, but because Carlo had chosen him. It was a move that had puzzled, and in many corners offended. Where Gambino had walked quietly, Castellano announced himself. Where Gambino had preferred warehouses and unions, Castellano leaned into white-collar schemes, stock fraud, loan sharking in the garment district, construction bid rigging. It was lucrative, yes, but it left the street soldiers cold. He started missing weddings, stopped attending funerals. He removed men who had once served loyally, replacing them with accountants, nephews, secretaries. The Gambino family, once defined by its poise and discipline, now grumbled beneath its surface. And beneath that grumble was a man whose name was beginning to be whispered in diners, bars, back rooms. John Gotti. Where Castellano was distant, Gotti was present. Where Castellano looked down from chandeliers, Gotti sat in corner booths, drank with his crew, laughed like he wasn't afraid of dying. To the soldiers he felt like one of them. To the captains he looked like a return to the code. By 1983, the split inside the family was no longer subtle. Gotti and his faction, based out of Ozone Park, resented the way Castellano ran things, especially the profits from narcotics, which Castellano forbade but still quietly taxed. The hypocrisy festered, respect crumbled, and Gambino's legacy began to bleed. It wasn't just about money. It was about identity. Paul Castellano had turned the family into a corporation, but the street didn't want a CEO. It wanted a boss. The final insult came in 1985, when Castellano skipped the funeral of Aniello Dela Croce, the family's longtime Underboss. Dela Croce had been the bridge between the old and the new, respected on both sides. His death was an inflection point. His absence from the ceremony to many felt like betrayal. And then came the dinner. December 16, 1985, Sparks Steakhouse, Midtown Manhattan. Castellano, wearing a camel hair overcoat, stepped out of a Lincoln Town car with his bodyguard, Tommy Bilotti. It was early evening. The Christmas lights on 46th Street glimmered in the window panes. They were due to meet with top capos, to smooth over what couldn't be smoothed. But they never made it inside. 4 men stepped forward, trench coats, handguns, silenced, methodical. Castellano was hit 6 times. Bilotti took half a dozen bullets before hitting the curb. No one ran, no one shouted. Within 90 seconds, both men lay in blood on the sidewalk where Carlo Gambino's name had once cast a long shadow. The assassination was public, theatrical, and effective. By the next morning, every newspaper in the city ran it above the fold. Mob boss gunned down in Midtown. Execution at Sparks. Underworld. Upheaval. Law enforcement scrambled. Detectives arrived too late to catch anyone, but they already knew who had filled the vacuum. John Gotti, the street kid with charm and teeth, was now boss. But what had died outside Sparks wasn't just Castellano. It was the old world, the careful hierarchy, the unspoken rules, the quiet codes Gambino had built brick by invisible brick. Gotti brought flash, interviews, tabloids, eyes. He ruled with swagger, drew cameras like fire draws moths. And with that light came heat. Within 5 years, half the organization would be indicted. The FBI would finally catch its white whale. The Gambino family, no longer silent, no longer invisible, no longer immune. And so the empire Carlo Gambino, built not from fear, but from structure, began to fracture not from force, but from pride. It was in many ways inevitable. Gambino had designed the perfect machine, but machines break when the hands guiding them forget that silence was the oil. And Paul Castellano, the man who inherited the crown, had traded that oil for polish. And polish in this world doesn't last long in the rain. There is no photograph of Carlo Gambino waving from a courthouse, no mugshot splashed across the front page, no quotes about loyalty, no signature cigar clenched between his teeth. There is only silence, a face in a crowd, a whisper behind velvet curtains. And yet, decades after his death, his name still moves men. In the long gallery of American crime lords, Capone, Luciano, Gotti, each played their hand with spectacle. Capone wore pinstripes like armor and let the world know he ran Chicago. He drank in public, dined loud, smiled at cameras, and ruled. Through fear and thunder, his empire was a symphony of blood. Roaring, chaotic, explosive. But he didn't last, Luciano. He was a visionary. Yes, he rewrote the script, replaced chaos with commission, turned street crime into a boardroom. But even Lucky, with all his charm and showmanship, ended up deported. He made deals with the government, appeared in interviews, tried to blend myth with politics, but his reign fractured the more he appeared. Then there was Gotti, the so-called dapper Don. Custom suits, smirks outside courtrooms, tabloid headlines. He loved being seen. He wanted the fame, the lights, the myth in real time, and for a while it worked. But in the end, it wasn't the bullets that got him. It was the attention. And then there was Carlo. No newspaper ever caught him off guard. No wiretap ever snagged his voice. No rival ever saw the blade coming until it was already gone. Where others raised glasses, Carlo lowered his gaze. Where others barked orders, he lifted an eyebrow. Where others built kingdoms in public, he laid foundations in shadow. He didn't wear power. He didn't shout it. He simply was. Gambino understood something the others didn't, that true control isn't visible. It isn't loud. It doesn't need validation. Control is quiet, and it lives in the places cameras don't reach. He held the throne not through fear, but through calculated omission. He didn't ban narcotics. He discouraged them. He didn't threaten. He paused, then let others connect the dots. He didn't hold meetings unless the walls were made of trust and marble informants would say it again and again. He never gave orders. He suggested, and those suggestions moved millions, money, men, murders, not because he shouted, but because no one ever wanted to test what silence might mean. He never set foot in Las Vegas, never appeared on television. He didn't own clubs, didn't flirt with celebrities, didn't care for flash. Instead, he built his world in incremental movements. A handshake, a debt, a look across a dinner table. The long game in an era of bloodshed. Gambino was a surgeon, a tactician. His hands didn't shake. He didn't act on impulse. He waited. He let others burn bright, then crumble. He let the noise draw attention elsewhere. He placed men exactly where he needed them and let time do the rest. That was his violence. Time itself. Patience as a blade, stillness as a weapon. In the FBI files, they called him the ultimate operator. No phone taps, no recordings, no direct ties. He was present, but always absent, in the room, but never the one speaking. And yet everything moved around him. No American don of his era, not one, died in a bed surrounded by family. Only Carlo, because Gambino understood something fundamental. Violence ends legacies, visibility ruins empires, but silence? Silence endures. Even now, his name carries weight, not because of what he did, but how he didn't. He didn't run when questioned. He didn't retaliate in fury. He didn't brag, didn't confess, didn't explain, and when he died, quietly. At home, in 1976, the press scrambled to summarize a man they had never caught. The last photograph ever taken of him wasn't in a courtroom. It wasn't outside a crime scene. It was on a sidewalk, holding his grandchild's hand, wearing a cardigan that was Carlo's genius. He made himself ordinary until it was too late for anyone to prove otherwise. He had no brand, no catchphrase, no nickname that stuck. Because he didn't want one, he wasn't building fame. He was building forever. And in the end, when the lights dimmed on the dawns who roared, it was the one who whispered who still ruled the room. They still whisper his name in Bensonhurst. Not loudly, not often. But if you sit long enough in one of those cracked vinyl booths at L and B Spumoni Gardens, or lean against the sun-faded bricks near 18th Avenue, you'll hear it tucked between rosary prayers and old curses. Gambino. And when they say it, some still cross themselves, not from fear exactly, but from a deeper kind of reverence, like mentioning a saint who never asked for worship, but received it anyway. Because even in death, even decades later, Carlo Gambino never left the room. He just learned how to live in the quiet between sentences. In the halls of organized crime history, names rise and fall like stock tickers. Capone, Gotti, Genovese, each with their arc, ascent, reign, collapse. But Gambino is different. He doesn't spike, he settles, he lingers like smoke beneath a door. His name is carved not into headlines, but into the architecture of how power behaves, how it speaks, softly, how it waits, how it moves without permission and retreats without noise. And in boardrooms in Sicily, in funeral homes in Queens, in the shadows of Naples and Newark, his model still holds. They call it the silent boss method, a blueprint passed down without attribution. No manuals, no recordings, only posture, only rhythm, only absence. Carlo's true monument was never the family itself. It wasn't the rackets or the money or the soldiers. It was the behavior he left behind. To watch but not be seen, to suggest, not command, to know everything and reveal nothing. In modern-day Italy, his style is studied like doctrine. L'uomo che non parlava, the man who did not speak. The Camorra quote him without quoting him. The 'Ndrangheta mimic his structure without ever saying his name, because to name him is to disturb the equilibrium. He is not a brand, he is not a legend. He is a template, and one that cannot be worn too loudly. Even the FBI never truly understood him. They wanted a face for the files, a motive for the moves, a thread to pull. But Gambino was airtight. His records read like poetry in code. All ellipses, no periods. Agents came and went. Surveillance vans idled for months. Informants folded, retired, vanished, but nothing stuck. The only words they could reliably attach to him: patient, elusive, utterly in control. In internal memos they called him the Ghost King, a presence felt but never proven. And long after he was gone, his name still appeared in margins, possibly a Gambino pattern, suspected continuation of C.G. methods, but no one could ever trace a clear fingerprint, because Gambino never left fingerprints. He left echoes. His descendants, too, learned the lesson. Unlike the sons of Gotti or Lucchese, Gambino's bloodline dissolved into anonymity. No book deals, no podcasts, no confessions dressed up as redemption. They understood what he taught best. Visibility is decay. If you want to preserve something, a family, a legacy, a truth, you bury it in silence today. You won't find a Gambino giving interviews. You won't find his grandkids in nightclubs. You won't see his name trending. But that's the point, because for them, power doesn't demand recognition. It dissolves into the fabric of life, into phone calls that never happen, into meetings no one announces, into neighborhoods where the rules are still followed, not because someone enforces them, but because someone once did. In Bensonhurst, some still remember, there's an old tailor shop 2 blocks from the park. The son runs it now, but the father, now 87, bent like a comma, still keeps a framed black and white photo on the wall. 3 men, blurred faces, one in the center wearing a long overcoat and a wool cap. He won't say who it is, but when asked, he smiles once and replies, "We used to." Sew the sleeves wider, for watches, for other things. That's all, no name, just a nod toward the past. Even in death, Carlo's power was never diminished, only displaced. It spread like ink in water, into places even he never touched, into prison yard philosophies, into union halls and shipping docks, into the architecture of threat and diplomacy across generations. His quiet taught people how to survive, how to rule, how to disappear, and in the underworld that's more valuable than any army. But his real legacy, it lives in a specific kind of silence, not the silence of fear, not the silence of threat, but the silence of awareness, the silence that lives in a room when a powerful name is mentioned, and no one chooses to follow it with a joke. It's a pause, a shift in posture, a slight turn of the head, because even now, to some, Carlo Gambino isn't dead. He's just no longer seen. He exists in that final layer of myth, the one that no story ever fully explains. So when documentaries list the top bosses, when books speculate and biographers chase ghosts, understand, this Gambino wasn't built for the spotlight. He was built for the afterglow. He didn't fight for attention. He fought for longevity, and he got it. not in the noise, but in the space between it, and in that space, in that cold breath of quiet, he still rules. The tape crackles before it begins, then a faint hiss, like wind brushing across gravel, and from beneath it, an old man's voice begins to rise, deliberate, calm, speaking in Sicilian, as though telling a story he's told many times before. No names, no declarations, only a parable, soft, slow, and strange in its simplicity. When the wolf learns to walk like the sheep, the voice says, he eats for years, not days. It isn't a threat, there's no menace in the tone, just patience and conviction. They found the recording by accident, a dust-worn reel in a brown envelope filed between expense reports and coded ledgers. No markings, no date, just a single line scribbled in pencil across the top flap. Carlo, tape 4, story time. The FBI analysts who processed it didn't know what they were hearing. No direct admissions, no damning evidence, but the voice was unmistakable. It was him, Carlo Gambino, the man who ruled a criminal empire but left behind only riddles, not in power, not in orders, but in how he spoke or didn't. The story continues. He describes a boy, a poor boy, who learns that wolves who bark never eat. Only the quiet ones survive long enough to lead. They don't chase, they wait. They don't demand, they observe. And if you listen closely, just beneath his breath, there's a pause, almost like a sigh, as if Gambino knew he was teaching something. Not meant for a file, but for a bloodline, for ears that would inherit silence like a crown. The narration fades, and what's left is Brooklyn. Not the Brooklyn of postcards or walking tours, but the one still tucked behind steel rolled-down gates, corner churches and marble stoops, a Brooklyn that remembers its early morning. Light breaks slow over Bay Parkway. An old Italian bakery opens its doors, flour dust rising like smoke. A priest nods to no one as he passes. A woman waters a plant too small for the pot it lives in, and beneath it all, in the grains of sidewalk and slant of stoop, you can still feel it, the residue of a rule. Don't talk, don't show, don't. Need 3 commandments, not written in ink, but in intent. Gambino never preached, he never explained. But his code, his rhythm outlived him. He taught men how to vanish while staying in the room, how to demand obedience without raising a voice, how to build something permanent by not being seen building it. And in that final recording, barely audible, barely real, he delivers the closest thing to a confession he ever gave. If they fear your anger, you've already lost. But if they respect your silence, you own them forever. Today, his face rarely shows up on T-shirts. No one brags about being his heir. His grave in St. John's Cemetery sits quietly under a modest stone. No flowers, no coins, only a name etched into time. Carlo Gambino, 1902 to 1976. But in certain courtrooms, when someone refuses to flip, in certain families, when a capo disappears without a sound, when meetings take place with no paper, no phones, no faces, that's him. That's the code still breathing, not because it's taught, but because it was once lived perfectly. As the camera pulls back, the street begins to still. Children walk to school, shopkeepers sweep. The world continues, but for those who know what power really looks like. Not in guns, not in suits, not in blood, but in quiet, structure, absence. They know Carlo Gambino didn't need to scream. He didn't need the stage. He just needed time and silence, and both obeyed him.